How to sew the Flower Shop Quilt. Make this beautiful quilt featuring a different flower in every window, a true heirloom quilt. Cutting out. Trim each of the flower blocks so they measure 10.5 inches high and 8.5 inches wide. The measurements for all of this is listed in the instructions. Now, to make sure that everything lines up nicely, cut the shelf so that it's in the same place. So you can see from here, I've cut the panel so it's 1.5 inches below the shelf, and then made sure that the flower arrangement is placed centrally. This will just give you a more even appearance on your finished quilt. So cut them all out to the same size and take a little time to do this to make sure they're all exactly the right height and width and that they're also placed centrally. So here's all the blocks that I've trimmed from the panels. There's August, September, October, November, and finally December. Put those to one side, and now from the quilt finishing panel, cut out all the pieces. If you read the instructions, it will tell you what size and how many pieces to cut from each of the panel. Some of the narrower pieces, like the windowsills and the side recesses and the window frames, are cut down to size because this just makes it more accurate when you're piecing it later. If you label all of them with the labels that are on the panel, you'll remember which is which. Now, with the outer borders that have all the images on them, like the wisteria and the plant pots, these are just cut round the outer edge. And the images will join up nicely when you assemble the whole quilt. But again, cut them out round the outer edge, the seam allowances are included, and pin the label to them so that you remember which piece is which. Your panel also includes extra plique pieces, so you can add more wisteria if you like. It's got a gift tag if you want to gift it, as well as a quilt label for you to label your quilt when you've finished. And there's also the Flower Shop sign. Now, this is optional, but you can applique this to the top of your flower shop when you've finished. And the details for this, again, are all in the instructions if you want to add this. Making the windows. Take the first block that you're going to do, I'm using the January block here, and place one windowsill piece right sides together with the bottom edge of the block. You can start with whatever block you like because they're all made in the same way, but I'm going to start with January because that's going to be on the left-hand side of row 1. Pin it together matching the raw edges and then stitch together to attach the windowsill to the block. Once that's done, press the seam over to one side towards the windowsill. And place this to one side. Now, take one windowsill corner and place it right sides up so that the wood grain runs vertically from the top to the bottom. Turn it over, making sure the wood grain stays the same way up. And take a ruler and a pen or a pencil, I'm using an erasable pen here, and draw a diagonal line from the bottom left to the top right corner. Now take one side recess and place this windowsill corner on the bottom edge. Make sure that you keep it the same wrong sides up with the line running from the bottom left to the top right, and match up the bottom and the side raw edges. Pin together either side of that diagonal line and then sew along the line. Once that's done, before you trim the seam allowance, take the top left corner, fold it over to the bottom right and press. By doing this, you can make sure that the corner is in exactly the right place and you've pulled it over properly. It's better to do this before you've trimmed. You can see now that the wood grains are facing the right way. By making sure that you have them facing vertically when you start, then when you sew it together, the wood grains will be facing the right way when you join the windowsill on. Trim off the seam allowance, press the seam open again, give it a nice press, and that section is finished. Now take the window block that you attached the windowsill to earlier, and place the side recess with the windowsill corner on the left-hand side, and then place it right sides facing on top. Now the important thing here is that this seam that joins the windowsill corner to the side recess meets the windowsill seam. Now the easiest way to do this is measure 1/4 of an inch down from the top on that seam, because that's your 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Now take a pin and push it through the seam at that 1/4 of an inch mark, and then push that pin through the seam of the windowsill 1/4 of an inch from the top. You can measure this or you can just judge that by eye. So push that exactly through. Now if you push the pin all the way through, you now know that those two seams match up exactly. This will just give you a neater finish. Now pin the seams together from the front, and you can remove that pin. Now pin the side recess with windowsill corner attached all the way down the left side of the flower block, making sure that you match raw edges. If you pin it at the top and the bottom first, you can then pin it together across the centre. Now sew these two pieces together. Once that's done, take it over to your ironing board and press the seam over to one side towards the side recess, and now you can see that the windowsill corner meets the windowsill exactly, and the wood grain is running in the same direction for the windowsill, so to give the appearance, that 3D appearance, which gives you the attic window style look. Now repeat this whole process with the remaining blocks. So you have all the window blocks. You've got January, February, March, April, May, June, July. You can see all the windowsills, the windowsill corners and the side recesses are in exactly the same place, all on the left side. The side recesses are of all of the blocks. There's October and November and December. So that's all your window blocks complete. Making the rows. You now need to join your window blocks together. So take all the window blocks for the top row. So you've got 3 window blocks. I've got January, February and March here. Now take an inner vertical window frame that you've cut earlier. You'll need 2 for this row. So just take one of them and sew it together along the right hand side of the first window block. If you turn it over and sew it from the side with the seam, then you can make sure that the seam between the flower block and the windowsill stays pressed over to one side. So if you place it in position first, then turn it over and pin it into place, you can make sure it's in the right place. Pin it together at the top and bottom, and then in the centre, and then sew those 2 pieces together. Once you've sewn those together, then join the next window block to the other side of the inner vertical window frame, and then sew another inner vertical window frame between window block 2 and window block 3. So in this one, February and March. Once you've done that, you've joined together row 1. For this, I have pressed the seams towards the window frame just because it raises it slightly and gives it a slightly more thicker look and more attractive when you finished your quilt. Make row 2 in exactly the same way. You'll use again 2 inner window frames between the blocks, and then make row 3 in exactly the same way, again joining the blocks together with the inner window frame, and then make row 4 again in the same way with the inner window frame blocks strips between the flower blocks. Again, you can see I pressed all the seams over towards the inner window frames to make them more raised. Joining the rows. Once you've joined the rows, now take one inner horizontal window frame and we're going to join that to bottom. When you're joining long strips on, it's easier if you fold them in half and mark the centre point first. Because it's such a long strip, then you can make sure it's evenly placed by pinning the centre first. So just place a pin in the centre of that edge. Now take row 1 and we're going to sew this to the bottom of row 1. So fold row 1 in half. If you match up the seams, you know it's exactly in half. And then just mark the centre point. You can just crease that with your finger for now. Open it up. And then just so you don't lose the crease, just mark it with a pin. Now take the inner horizontal window frame and match up those centre marks. So just match up the pins, make sure that you place them right sides facing and pin them together. Now, because there are a lot of seams in row 1, we're going to pin and sew from the row 1 side to make sure all those seams stay pressed over to one side as we've done before. So once you've got the centre marked, pin the inner horizontal window frame to one edge of row 1, matching up the raw long edges and the short edge. Then you can pin it together between the centre pin and the outer pin. Make sure the raw edges are meeting up by just pulling it slightly and pin it together along there. Just rearrange it just to make sure that the raw edges are matching up. But because you're dealing with a shorter length, because you've pinned it in the centre, that's easier. When you get to the seams, you can pin those into place to make sure they stay where you've pressed them when you're sewing. Now pin it together from the centre pin to the other edge. Again, start by matching up the end. And then pin it together between the centre pin and the end pin. Again, making sure the raw edges match up by just rearranging it slightly. Because you've got seams in row 1, you'll have to give it a little pull to pull it to fit, but they are the same size because you've trimmed them. Now once it's all pinned together, sew together all the way along the edge, starting from one end, making sure those seams stay pressed over to the side as you're stitching so they're not twisted. Now that's done, you can see I've sewn the inner horizontal window frame to the bottom and I've pressed the seam towards the window frame, again to make the window frame a little bit more raised. Now you can sew the bottom of that window frame to the top edge of row 2. Again, mark the centres and pin those into place, and also make sure the window frames, those vertical window frames, match up as you pin and then when you sew. So just make sure they're matching up and then you'll get a more even looking window. Once you've done that, you've joined row 2. You can then join row 3 into place with an inner horizontal window frame, and then join row 4 into place with an inner horizontal window frame. Again, you can see all my vertical window frames are matching up. And if I turn it over, you can see all the seams are pressed towards the window frames. So all the window frames are now joined and you've joined all the rows together. Adding the outer window frame. Take one outer side window frame and sew it right sides facing down the right hand side of the joined rows and inner window frames. In the same way as you joined the last set of frames, fold it in half first to find the centre. And mark that with a pin, and then fold the right hand side of the joined rows together and mark, and then pin it together at the centre and the outer edges, and then take the other outer side window frame and sew that down the left hand side. Again, mark the centre first and pin it into place, and then pin it along the outer edge, and then sew the two sides into place. So now you see I've joined the outer side window frames to either side of the rows. And again, I've pressed the seam towards the window frame. Now lay it all out flat again and take one outer top bottom window frame and sew that along the top edge. As before, fold it in half first to find the centre. Find the centre of the top edge of the rows. Pin at the centre and then sew it together all the way along. You're going to be overlapping on top of the outer side window frames to frame the whole piece. And then take the other outer top bottom window frame and sew that right sides facing all the way along the bottom edge. Again, folding to find the centre, pinning in the centre, pinning at the edges and sewing it together. Adding the borders. Start by sewing the right side border to the right side of the joined pieces and the left side border to the left side of the joined pieces. Once you've done that, you can sew the top border. So just place it into position along the top to start with. But make sure that you've pressed all the seam allowances. Now, I press my seam allowances towards the outer window frames here. You can press them open or to one side. It's entirely up to you, but just make sure you press them in the same direction. Now, take the top border and place that along the top, making sure it's the right way up, and place it right sides down on top. And pin it into place. So you'll see that the wisteria on the top edges will match up with the borders. Pin that into place and sew together. Now take the bottom border and sew this into place in the same way. Again, all the prints will match up, but I would just double check when you are sewing the pots into place. It's important that the tree trunks match up. So what I did, placed it right sides facing, and I just made sure the trunks matched up and placed in a couple of extra pins there just to make it more even. Once you've done that, you can see the wisteria curves around the top edge, and it will all match up nicely. And then when you go right down to the bottom, you can see the only thing you need to match up there are the trunks, which I placed some extra pins, but because it's printed to the right size, you'll find it does match up. Don't forget to always pin together at the centres first before you then pin at the outer edges. And you've got a nice neat finish now. And you can see all the borders meet up nicely around the edges of your finished top. Adding the sign. The Flower Shop sign is included on your quilt finishing panel for you to add if you want. What I've done is press Bondaweb to the back of my sign. This is optional, but it just makes it a little easier to put into place. If you want to add that, then measure the centre of the section between the wisteria and also the top and the bottom. Then peel off the paper backing and you can press and stitch it into place. If you don't have Bondaweb, just cut it out and stitch it into place. Now, if you want to add the month labels, these are included with the Flower Shop blocks. So what I've done with these, I've pressed Bondaweb to the wrong side of all of the little labels, peel off the paper backing, and then just place them centrally on the window frame. You can put them on the windowsill or the window frame, it's entirely up to you, and then stitch them into place. You can see with the Flower Shop sign, I've used a decorative blanket stitch on my machine, but you can just top stitch it. And then with all the month labels, I've just top stitched it round the edge, just very slowly by machine, just to attach them. But these are optional and you can leave them out if you prefer, but they just give it a nice finish and they've been printed in colours to match the panel. So once you've placed them all into place, again, play with them a little bit. You might decide you want them on the windowsill rather than on the window frames. Just decide how you would like to place them, or just leave them out. And then when everything is sewn on, your quilt top is now finished. Finishing the quilt. Once you've pieced the quilt and you've layered it with the backing fabric and the wadding, you can quilt it in whatever way you like. I've quilted around the window frames. I also machine quilted around all the vases. But then with the softer elements like the leaves and the wisteria and the pot plants, I've hand quilted those just to give it a slightly softer finish. Or you can do an all over quilting pattern of just horizontal lines, vertical lines, or crosshatch, whichever you prefer. I just decided to quilt around the window frames. Then you need to bind the quilt. The details for this are in the instructions, but for a more in-depth tutorial, visit the Amber Makes website in the Learn to Sew section, where I take you through step by step of exactly how to bind a quilt, how to join the ends, and how to mitre the corners. Once you've done that, hang it up and your beautiful Flower Shop quilt is now finished.